Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is Omolo the Great, and today we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. Remember to subscribe and hit the subscription button. Also share and like this video. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. What do we understand by the cardiac cycle? Simply, the cardiac cycle, we should refer to the events that take place between each heartbeat. Okay? So all the events, this describes all the events that will take place between one beat or between each beat or within each beat. All right. So there are different events that take place, the different cardiac events. There are several cardiac events and we can classify them in different ways. So these are the cardiac events. Okay. So we want to look at each of the events that take place. One, we have what we call the electrical changes. Okay, what we call the electrical changes, or what we may refer to as the ECG changes. So this would then too, after the electrical changes, okay, so we also want to look at the mechanical changes, okay, after the mechanical changes. So under these mechanical changes, we shall see, basically we shall see the concept of systole and then diastole. And then the other changes we shall see are the volume changes. The volume changes. And then we shall also look at the pressure changes. Okay, the pressure changes. And then we can also see what we call valvular changes. Okay, the valvular changes of the heart. We see the opening and the closure of the different valves, and this also produces sound changes. Okay, we shall also be looking at the different heart sounds. Okay, the different heart sounds. So these are the various events that take place within our cardiac cycle. Electrical changes, this depolarization or the actual potential that's generated within this cardiac muscle. This results in two changes, mechanical changes, which can be either contraction or relaxation, and this brings about systole or diastole. And then we have this relaxation or contraction can bring about changes in the volumes within the different chambers of the heart. And these volume changes also result into build up of pressure or fall in the pressure, bring about pressure changes, which will bring about these changes result into either closure, opening of the different valves of the heart, and then this activity of the valves can also produce sound, especially the heartbeats, as we shall be seeing. So this is what we want to look at. So, but for us, we shall be discussing each of these changes within the different phases of the cardiac cycle. Okay, so wherever you wish to start the description of the cardiac cycle, remember you have to discuss and get back to that point. So let's look at the different phases of the cardiac cycle. Okay, so we look at the phases of the cardiac cycle. Okay, so in these phases, what do we want to see? So we shall start our description from the atria. Okay, so if I use this to be a representation of my atria, okay, or of my heart, okay, so something like this. So where we have, of course, obviously, this is my atria, okay, and then we have this is the mitral valve. This is on the left side, and then this will be my aortic valve. So if you wish to see, let me try and magnify this in this way. So this will be in our discussion. I'll try to use this as our heart, okay, where we have, this is on the right side, where we have the right atrium, okay, and then we have the right ventricle. Then we have this the tricuspid valve. then this is the pulmonary artery valve, and then this is the pulmonary artery. And then what happens on the right side also takes place on the left side. This way we shall have the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then the aorta, okay, with its aortic valve and this mitral valve. So we shall continue to use our discussion will be mainly be on the discussion on the left side, because we know what happens on the left side also happens on the what? On the right side. Okay. So let's continue. So what happens at this point? Okay. So the first phase is what I'm going to call atriosystole. Okay. Phase 1, which is atriosystole. So during atriosystole, what happens? Systole is the contraction of the what? Of the atriosystole involves contraction of the atria. Okay. So we realize that before the muscle actually contracts, there is always initial excitation of the muscle following a generation of an impulse. So the electrical activity, electrical changes, this is during atriosystole. We expect the atria to undergo a depolarization. So atrial depolarization, which is represented by the P wave of the ECG, okay, so is what will synonymously occur at the time and bring about atriosystole. So during atriosystole, okay, so before the atria contracts, usually the ventricles are about 80% full, okay, of blood. And then this atrial contraction literally brings about just about additional 20% of blood within the ventricle, okay? So atriosystole involves contraction of the atria, and by the time atriosystole is occurring, usually the ventricles are about 80% full. We shall see where this 80% will be coming from. So this atrial contraction brings about 20%, implying that if someone has a challenge or a problem with their atrium, okay, implying that the ventricles are, which are already 80% full, so they can survive with the 80% of blood within the ventricle, only if they do not exert physical activity. So the moment they move, the moment they engage in any physical activity, then they will develop symptoms having a deficit in this 20%. Okay, so these people can actually live normal lives as long as they keep their activity more minimal or at rest. And when they exert some physical activity, then they will bring about they get symptoms following this deficit of the 20%. So what happens during this atriosystole? So we have the pressure. Let's look at the changes. Electrical changes, we said at this point, the P wave, okay, of the ECG. The P wave, which causes atrial contraction. This is atrial depolarization. The P wave will result into atrial contraction, okay? So the contraction of the atria drops all this blood, empties the remaining part of the blood into the ventricle, okay? So implying that the volume of the ventricle does what? The volume does what? Decreases. And then the pressure in the ventricle, because of this exertion, the pressure will create a pressure wave, okay? We have a pressure wave called an A wave. So the pressure change within the atria gives us an atrial pressure wave called the A wave, following atrial contraction, okay? So this feeling of the heart, feeling of the ventricle after at the end of systole gives us a volume of blood that is within this ventricle, and this total volume of blood that has occurred. This is usually at the end of the feeling or at the end of ventricular diastole. This gives us a volume which we refer to as the end diastolic volume. Okay, so this is the end diastolic volume, the volume of blood that is within the ventricle at the end of diastole or at the end of feeling. So during this period, of course, this our atria, rather the mitral valve, is open, but the aortic valve is actually closed. Okay, and remember, we shall be discussing the pressures around the aorta are usually about 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and then the pressures of the atria usually build to about 5 or to 7. Okay, we shall take 5 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and then pressures in the ventricle usually can be as low as 0 to 2 or 3 millimeters of mercury. So during atrial systole, this is what happens, and this is what we expect. Okay, so this is the first phase. So blood has accumulated within the ventricle. What happens next? The second thing we are going to see here is this. Okay, so this is 1, this is 2. Okay, so what happens? We saw that the ventricles are already full of blood. Okay, the ventricles are full of blood on a closed aortic valve, and then the mitral valve was open. Okay, so the ventricle, what happens? The ventricle starts to build a pressure. Okay, so the pressure here of 5 millimeters of mercury, the ventricles here start to build a pressure, which pressure it builds up, and as soon as it exceeds the pressure within the atria, okay, the pressures exceed, this is a pressure of 5, as soon as it exceeds the pressure of atria, maybe at a increases up to around 6 millimeters of mercury, it causes closure of these valves. Okay, it causes closure of the mitral valve. Okay, so the closure of this mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, or the closure of the atrioventricular valves, this closing activity produces a sound, which is the first heart sound, which is S1. So we shall have the S1 heart sound, which is produced during this period. Okay, so the first heart sound that is produced following the closure of the atrioventricular valves. Okay, so this is what happens. Closure of the atrioventricular valves, we have S1, and then these pressures actually continue to build. Okay, we said we had the pressure of around 80 millimeters of mercury. The pressures here continue to build in a closed chamber. So you see the ventricle has been closed off, the outlets. The ventricle has been closed off here. The mitral valve is closed, and also the aortic valve is closed. So pressure is building within this closed chamber, and this duration, or this period when the pressure is building within the closed chamber, is what we call an isovolumetric contraction. Okay, so this is the second phase of the cardiac cycle. So the isovolumetric contraction, we're having contraction of this ventricle. Okay, following no change in the volume. Okay, we say the end diastolic volume, which is actually usually about 120 mils. So the end diastolic volume is not changing, and also the muscles are the cardiac muscle is contracting without change in length, what we call the isovolumetric contraction. So what happens in the atria? We said initially we had the A wave followed atrial contraction, but also this pressure that exceeds, that closes closure of the mitral valves, also exerts a compression onto the atria, okay, onto the right atria, and this exerts another pressure wave, which is the C wave, onto the atria. Okay, so but also you realize as soon as we start ventricular, you see isovolumetric contraction, this is the first phase in ventricular systole. So because systole is ventricular contraction, as soon as the ventricle starts contracting or starts ventricular systole, we get an onset of atrial diastole. So we start receiving, because these valves are closed, and then we start getting return of blood through the pulmonary vein from the lungs. Okay, blood starts returning from the lungs. So this return of blood from the lungs will start increasing the volume within the atria, and also because of the increase in volume initiates another pressure wave of the atria, which is called the V wave. Okay, so this is what happens. Let's see the next phase. The next phase, so what happens? So we have here our valve is closed, and also our aortic valve is also closed initially. And then we have pressure. Okay, the pressure here, we say the pressure is 80 millimeters of mercury, and here we are, the ventricles during isovolumetric contraction are building a pressure. They build a pressure up to around 80. They want to equilibrate the pressure within the ventricle to reach the pressure within the aorta. So as soon as the pressure in the aorta exceeds as soon as the pressure in the ventricle exceeds the pressure in the aorta, even by 1 millimeter of mercury, it now causes the opening of this aortic valve. Okay, so it causes opening of the aortic valve. Okay, because the pressure here is higher than the pressure in the aorta. So this, because of the initial buildup of pressure, as soon as you open, what happens? You get a surge, okay, a rapid surge or ejection of blood into the aorta, okay, and that is what we call the rapid ejection phase. So the pressure here, you get a rapid ejection of blood into the aorta, and so this is what we call the rapid ejection phase. Okay, you get a rapid ejection phase of blood from the ventricle into the aorta. Okay, so and then what happens? Obviously, we are still continuing with our atrial filling, or atrial diastole is continuing. So this efflux of blood, rapid influx of blood into the aorta. Of course, the aorta is a big artery which will try to distend and accommodate all these huge amounts of blood that are within the that are coming from the ventricle. And then next, what happens? You realize that for this blood to keep moving into the aorta, the pressure here has to build and equilibrate the pressure in the aorta so that we can keep the pathway open. Okay, so we need to balance the pressure on this side and this side. So as volume is increasing within the aorta, okay, as volume increases within the aorta, that also increases the pressure within the aorta. So you see the pressure builds within the aorta from around 80, pressure can build up to 120 millimeters of mercury. Okay, these are open valves, including that the pressure here also keeps building 81 up to maybe 120. So we can have we can keep this this pathway open. Okay, we can keep this pathway open for blood to keep flowing into the aorta. So, and this results into another phase. So after the rapid ejection phase, we actually move into another wave which is called the slow ejection phase of the ventricle. Okay, so you see blood now continues to leave from the ventricle into the aorta. So important to note the volume changes within the ventricle. Initially, we said we had the end diastolic volume. Okay, so the fraction of blood, the total fraction of blood that will leave from the fraction or the amount of blood, the amount of blood that leaves into the aorta. Okay, that blood is called the stroke volume. Okay, which is the amount of blood that is pumped from the ventricle into the aorta. Okay, so the proportion of the end diastolic volume that is shunted into the aorta is also what we shall call the ejection fraction, or the fraction of the end diastolic volume that is ejected into the aorta is the ejection fraction. So the amount of blood that is ejected into the aorta is what we call the stroke volume. So which means the ejection fraction is equal to just a fraction of the stroke volume, okay, over the end diastolic volume. Okay, so the stroke volume is usually about 70 mils. Okay, 70 mils in volume. Okay, so during the slow ejection phase, as we said, blood continues to move into the aorta. Obviously, atrial diastole is actually continuing. Okay, so What next happens? The next phase of our cardiac cycle is actually as blood is accumulating within the aorta, okay, we say this valve obviously is closed and this is open. The pressures within the pressures here, pressure is built up to 120, and pressure, we had the pressure of 120. Pressure in the ventricle now starts to fall, okay? So as soon as the pressures fall up to around below the pressure in the aorta, up to around 119, this causes sort of a backflow of blood, okay? Blood always wants to move from a higher pressure to a low pressure. This causes the initial backflow of blood from the aorta back into the ventricle, okay? But this backflow of blood from the aorta into the ventricle is actually going to cause a closure, okay? So these valves are like this. As soon as blood is returning from up, this state causes what? A closure of the aortic valve. So instead, this tendency to backflow of blood, okay, instead causes a closure of these atrioventricular valves, okay? And this closure of the atrioventricular, or rather, sorry, the semilunar valves. This is the aortic valve, the semilunar valves. So the closure of the semilunar valves or this aortic valve will give us the second heart sound, S2, okay? Will give us the second heart sound, S2, okay? And also, next, what happens is that as these pressures continue to actually fall, okay? They tend to fall more and more below. They need to get back to the initial 2 millimeters of mercury. So this fall in the pressure following a closed chamber, okay, the valve here is closed and also this valve is closed. This fall in the pressure within the ventricle is what we call the next phase, which is called an isovolumetric relaxation, okay? This is an isovolumetric relaxation. Obviously, we still have our blood that is returning from the lungs, okay? So obviously you see atrial diastole is still occurring, okay? But as soon as the pressure in the ventricle falls below the pressure of the atria, that is going to cause now opening, because blood will move from a higher pressure to what? To a low pressure chamber. So let's see what happened next. So we have closed off this valve, the aortic valve is closed. So we've been accumulating a lot of blood, okay, during atrial diastole within the atria. So as soon as these pressures keep falling, so usually pressure we say about 5 millimeters of mercury. As soon as the pressure fall to about 4 millimeters of mercury below the pressure of the atria, this is going to cause opening of the what? Opening of the mitral valve, okay? And this opening of the mitral valve is going to cause a rapid gush, okay, or inflow of blood into the ventricle, okay? So this rapid inflow of blood into the ventricle, okay, is this phase, we call it a rapid passive filling phase, okay? So this is the rapid passive filling phase, okay? So the ventricles rapidly fill with blood, and this is the one that actually accounts for this 80% that we have talked about. So this initial, it's a passive phase because we don't have any contraction of these muscles, okay, of these cardiac muscles. It's just opening of these valves due to the fall in the pressure and causes a rapid inflow of blood, okay. So this all the blood that has accumulated from the within the atria during atrial diastole is now causes what? Inflow of blood into the ventricle. And obviously after this, after the blood, 80% of blood has been filled in the ventricle, now we get back to atria contracting to give us the atrial systole, to give us the other 20% of blood that is coming within the ventricle. So we realize some things. Under the mechanical changes, so the atrial changes, rather the electrical changes, we saw atrial depolarization that will give us atrial systole, and then obviously we see the QRS wave, okay, that will give us the QRS wave. This is ventricular depolarization, which will give us ventricular contraction or give us in the phase of ventricular systole, and then the T wave, which is ventricular repolarization, which will give us the ventricular diastole. Okay, so let's see. So you see from here, this is atriosystole, duration of atriosystole. So atriosystole, okay, so atriosystole is usually takes about 0.1 seconds. And then the ventricular systole, first let's talk about then atriosystole, rather atriodiastole. This one takes about 0.7 seconds, okay. So this filling phase takes about the atrio, you see the duration of the atria filling after atriosystole, which is about 0.1 seconds. You see all through during ventricular systole, the atria are filling, the atria are in ventricular diastole. So the atria are in diastole, so you form, they take a much longer time, which is about 0.7 seconds. And so the total of this will actually give us the 0.8 seconds, which is the duration of one cardiac cycle. But also if you look at the ventricles, okay, the ventricles, so in ventricular systole, okay, so ventricular systole takes about 0.3 seconds, and then ventricular diastole, which takes about 0.5 seconds, which is 0.8 seconds. So the total duration of the cardiac cycle is still what? Is still 0.8 seconds. So whichever cardiac event you want to, follow, we should be able to give you the same duration in a normal heart. Okay. So realize that the phases of ventricular systole, the ventricles start contracting. The first phase of ventricular systole is isovolumetric contraction. Second phase of ventricular systole is during this rapid ejection phase, and then we have the slow ejection phase. So this is all happening during ventricular systole, okay? And then during ventricular diastole, we start seeing the ventricles relaxing during this isovolumetric relaxation, and then during this first phase of rapid, during the rapid filling phase. So these are the phases of the cardiac cycle. And so we've looked at, under each you realize the different electrical changes, which are the ECG changes we have looked at. Mechanical changes, we looked at the atriosystole, ventricular systole, atriodiastole, ventricular diastole. Volume changes, under each description, during atriosystole, you see the volume actually decreases, and then during ventricular systole, you see the volume doesn't change during isovolumetric contraction, but the volume here decreases following an ejection of blood into the aorta. So the volume of the ventricle actually decreases, and we said at the end of diastole we have an end diastolic volume, and then that volume that leaves into the aorta, which is the stroke volume, and the proportion of the end diastolic volume that leaves into the aorta is what we call the stroke volume. So the volume of blood that remains in the heart, that remains in the ventricle at the end of systole, okay, after the ejection phase, okay, after the slow ejection, the volume of blood that has remained within the ventricle at the end of systole is what they call the end systolic volume, which is usually about 50 mils of blood. So which means the end, if you want to get the end diastolic volume, is the summation of the end of the stroke volume plus the end systolic volume, okay? And then still you can get your ejection fraction, which is usually about 0.6 or 60%. All right. Yes, so then the pressure changes, we saw the pressure change curve, the atrial pressure curves that occur, the A wave during atriosystole, the C wave during after the closure of the atrioventricular valves, and then the V wave following the filling during atriodiastole. And then the valvular changes, we said the closure and opening of the valves, as we've seen. This results in two heart sounds. So the first heart sound, which is S1, that occurs at the closure of the atrioventricular valves, especially in this case the mitral valve. This produces the first heart sound, which is S1. The second heart sound, which follows the closure of the aortic valve, okay, or the semilunar valves producing the second heart sound. And then there is also another heart sound, which is a S3. Okay, S3. This heart sound is usually not very audible. Okay, if you by listening. So maybe another thing you should remember: S1 usually gives us the lab. Okay, and then S2 will give us the dub. Okay, you will see this this kind of terms being used. So S3 usually not very audible, and S3 usually occurs following blood that returned when blood is rapidly gushing during the rapid filling, passive filling phase. This blood that rapidly enters or gushes into the ventricle, it's because it is impacting onto this ventricle, okay, this ventricular wall, usually produces some sound. Okay, so it's not regularly audible, but if you amplify using a microphone during phonocardiography or using a stethoscope, you may actually be able to pick the third heart sound. Whereas the fourth heart sound, this is usually, it's a pathological sound. Patients who have hypertension, okay, patients with hypertension, for example. So those patients with hypertension, if you have hypertension, okay, your total peripheral resistance is actually very high. So implying that the pressure within the aorta required to pump blood against this resistance, these pressures have to build maybe to around maybe 140, okay, implying even the ventricle has to build a much higher pressure to overcome, be able to pump this blood into the aorta until there may be a pressure of around 160. So implying that, so for these ventricles to be able to pump this blood against this pressure, what do? They tend to increase muscle. So as they increase muscle, they actually undergo hypertrophy, ventricular hypertrophy. Okay, so this return of blood in this kind of heart, following with hypertrophied heart, following hypertension, this return of blood into the ventricle, okay, usually causes vibrations through this myocardium. So these vibrations within the myocardium, as blood returns, actually produces a heart sound, okay, which is the S4 heart sound. So S4 is typically a pathological heart sound. All right, so this brings me to the end of our discussion on the cardiac cycle. Please remember to subscribe and share and like this video, and we meet next time. Thank you.